There are questions a man asks because he wants an answer. And then there are questions a man asks because he wants to watch something break. The night Amos Rourke married her, he asked the second kind. He asked it slow, with a full glass in his hand and half the town crowded into that little board church, 40 pairs of eyes on the woman who'd stood up beside him not an hour before and said yes. He wanted her small. He wanted her to say the thing every soul in that room was already thinking, that she'd married him for a roof and a name and nothing underneath, that a woman like her couldn't want a man like him for any reason but shelter. I was there. I had my ledger open on my knee, the way I always do, because I don't trust my own memory anymore, and I wanted to get it down before it slipped. I figured I was about to write the moment a proud woman got broken in a room full of strangers who'd already decided what she was. I was wrong. What she said back to him, 6 words, maybe 7. I've read them over more times than I can count, and I still have to set the book down partway through. So stay with me, because the cruelest question I ever heard a man put to a woman got the one answer he never saw coming. It changed him. Truth be told, it changed all of us who were standing close enough to hear. My name is Silas Ward. This is exactly how it happened, every word I could catch. The lamps were smoking because nobody had trimmed the wicks, and that's the first thing I wrote down. God help me, lamps smoking, room too hot, Mrs. Deacon fanning herself with the hymn sheet. Because when a thing gets too big to look at straight, I write down the small stuff around the edges. It's a habit I picked up after the fever took most of what I had in '78, my wife included, and left me a man who can't hold a memory in his head longer than it takes to lose it. So I hold them in a book instead. Cattle, weather, debts, the things people say. My whole life is a column of numbers and a column of words, and I trust the book more than I trust myself. I wish I hadn't trusted it that night. There's things in there now I'd give a good horse to unwrite. Amos Rourke married the Apache woman on the last Sunday in October, in the Plank Church at Coldwater Crossing, and the only reason the church was full was that nobody wanted to miss it. That's the plain truth. Half those people hadn't set foot inside a church since the last time somebody got hanged nearby. They came the way folks come to a house fire, not to help, just to feel the heat and go home with a story. Her name was Desna Chiricahua. I know that now because I made a point of learning it, which puts me one ahead of most of the county, who never called her anything but Rourke's woman if they were being polite and worse if they weren't. She stood up front in a gray dress that somebody, I found out later it was the widow Alvarez, the only other soul in that town who'd shown her a kindness, had let out at the seams and hemmed to fit. Her hair was braided tight and pinned, done up the way settler women wear it, and I remember thinking she'd have looked handsomer with it loose, done her own way, but of course she couldn't. This whole night was a costume she was being made to wear, every part of it. The dress, the pins, the preacher's English words she answered in careful English of her own. The ring Amos jammed onto her finger like he was closing a gate. She didn't flinch when he did it. I watched for it. She held her chin level and her eyes forward, and she took that ring the way you'd take a coal off a stove if you had to, quick, controlled, giving nothing away. I'd seen her exactly twice before that night. The first time was at Cobb's Station out on the freight road, maybe 4 months back, and I'll get to that, because it's the whole rotten root of this thing. The second time was the morning Amos rode over to my place with a face like a fence post and told me he was getting married, and did I have a spare Sunday coat, because he'd be damned before he bought a new one for it. Married, I said. I set down my coffee. To who? Desna, he said it flat like a fact off a bill of sale. The one from Cobb's. I knew who he meant, I just didn't understand it. Amos. How'd that come about? I paid off what she owed Cobb, he said. $41 and a debt he'd never have let her out from under. Man was working her to nothing and worse. I paid it. And there's a marshal's man been sniffing around Coldwater saying any Apache off the reservation with no white household to account for them gets took back to San Carlos in irons. He looked out at my corral instead of at me. A wife is a household, so. So you married her to keep her out of irons, I said. I married her because I needed a woman to keep the house and cook, and I got tired of Cobb's face, he said, and it was such an obvious lie that neither of us bothered with it. Amos Rourke buried his wife Ellen 3 years before, and their little boy the same winter, both of them to the diphtheria, and after that he'd let the house go to a kind of grief you could smell when you walked in. Cold stove, dust on Ellen's dishes, her sewing basket sitting exactly where she'd left it because he couldn't move it and couldn't throw it out. He hadn't needed a housekeeper. He needed to stop being alone in that house with the ghosts, and he'd rather have died than say so. Here's my sin in all of it, and I'll set it down plain because that's what the book is for. When he told me, I said, well, cheap help anyhow. Long as she does the work and doesn't cut your throat, what's it matter? I said that to make it easy for him, to let him keep his lie. God forgive me, I helped him build the wall he hid behind. Now the supper. After the preacher said his piece, they moved everyone across to the schoolhouse, where the women had laid out a spread on the long tables, not for her. Understand, for the occasion, which is a different thing. Desna sat at the head of the table beside Amos and did not eat. She kept her hands folded in her lap, and she watched the room the way I've watched a storm come up over the Chiricahuas, reading it, measuring how much time she had before it broke. Because it was going to break, everyone could feel it. The one holding the match was Owen Deacon. Deacon ran cattle north of Amos, and he'd lost a brother to a raiding party back in '71, and there is no arguing a man out of a grief that old. It's gone to bone by then. It's part of how he stands up in the morning. Deacon had been drinking since the church. He had a way of talking loud and sideways, saying a thing to the man next to him, but pitching it so the whole table caught it. Handsome supper, he said. For a what do we call this exactly? A wedding? That what we're calling it? He grinned around the table for support and got some, in the form of that low, mean chuckle men make when they're glad someone else said the thing out loud. Amos didn't answer. He was drinking steady and looking at nothing. I'm asking honest, Deacon went on louder. Amos, help me. My brother's under a rock north of Apache Pass on account of her people. And I'm to sit here and eat cake and call her Mrs. Rourke? That's the ask. Eat or don't, Owen, Amos said, low. But it had gone into him. I could see it going in. Amos Rourke was a proud man and a hard one, and the hardest thing about him was that he could not stand to be laughed at, could not stand to be the fool at his own table. And Deacon had just told the whole room that's exactly what he was, a man who'd been made a fool of by a woman with a debt and a pretty way of holding still. And I watched Amos decide to prove he wasn't. I watched him do it, and I'd have stopped him if I'd known what he was reaching for, but you don't ever know, do you? Not until it's out of the man's mouth and can't go back in. He set down his glass. He turned in his chair slow, and he looked at Desna for the first time all night like he was actually looking at her. And there was something awful in his face, not hate. I want to be fair, it wasn't hate. It was a man drowning and grabbing for the nearest thing to push under so he could get a breath. All right, Amos said, loud enough now for the whole room. The talking stopped. The scrape of forks stopped. Mrs. Deacon quit fanning herself. All right, let's have it out plain since everybody's so curious. Let's not pretend. Amos, I said. I didn't even know what I was warning him off of. I just knew the room had gone the wrong kind of quiet. He didn't hear me. He was looking at his wife of 1 hour. Tell them, he said to her. Tell them the truth so they'll all quit looking at me like I've been took. You didn't marry me. You married my roof and my name and $41, and there's nothing under it, and there never was. Say it. His voice cracked right down the middle on the last of it, and he covered the crack with meanness, the way a man will. Go on, tell this whole room you don't want me. Give them that much and let's be done. There it was. You have to understand what he'd done. He'd cornered her in the only place a person can't fight from. If she said no, I do want you, with that ring not an hour old and paid for like a heifer, in front of a room that hated her, she'd have shamed herself into the dirt, made herself a liar and a beggar both. And if she said yes, it's true, there's nothing under it. Then he'd have his out. He'd be the cold, clever man who bought cheap help and was never fooled at all. And she'd have signed away in front of witnesses any small human thing she might have had. Either way she lost. That was the whole design of it. A cruel question is just a trap wearing a coat. The lamp nearest me smoked. I wrote, he asked her to unmake herself, and my hand wasn't steady. Desna looked at him. She didn't look scared. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Everybody in that room was braced for her to break or beg or spit, and she did none of it. She looked at Amos Rourke for a long moment. So long the silence started to hurt. And then she unfolded her hands from her lap and set them flat on the table, careful, like she was steadying herself against something the rest of us couldn't feel. And she opened her mouth to answer him. I've thought a good deal in the years since about how a whole life can hinge on a handful of words, and whether the person saying them knows in the moment that they're standing on the hinge. I think Desna knew. I think she'd known for a long while that a night like this was coming, one way or another, and she'd decided already what she'd do when it did. That's the only way I can account for how calm she was, with the trap shut around her ankle and the whole room leaning in to watch her chew her own leg off. She looked at him and she said, quiet but it carried, "You gave the old man water." That was all to start. Amos blinked. Whatever he'd braced for, it wasn't that. What? At Cobb's station. Her English was careful, each word set down like she was laying stones across a creek, finding the footing. The old man in the yard, my mother's brother. He was dying 3 days in the sun, and every man who came through stepped over him or around him, and Cobb would not waste water on a dying Indian. 3 days. She let that sit. You came through on the 4th morning. You were nothing to us. You were only a man buying axle grease. And you saw him, and you asked Cobb whose he was, and Cobb said nobody's, said let him die. And you, her voice held level but her hands pressed flatter against the table, and I saw the knuckles go pale. You knelt down in Cobb's yard with the whole road watching, and you gave my uncle water from your own canteen. And when he died that night, you would not let them drag him off for the dogs. You made them put him in the ground. You dug part of it yourself, a stranger. You covered his face with your own hat, and you did not take the hat back. The room did not make a sound. I have never in my life heard a full room make so little sound. You do not remember it, she said, and it wasn't an accusation. It was almost gentle, and that was somehow the worst of it. I have watched you these 4 months not remember it. It was nothing to you. A small thing on a bad morning that you forgot before your horse was watered. She took a breath, and here her voice moved for the first time, just a tremor under it, quick gone. It was not nothing to me. It was the first time in 2 years a white man looked at one of mine and saw a person and not a problem. You ask me why I married you. You want me to say your roof, your name, your $41. She shook her head once. No, I married the man who gave the old man water. I have been waiting to find out if he was still in there. That is my answer. That is the whole of it. And she folded her hands back into her lap and looked forward again, done, having given him exactly the truth he demanded, and none of the shame he'd been fishing for. I want to tell you what that did to Amos Rourke's face. I can't quite. I've tried to get it into the book a dozen times, and every time the words come out too small. It was like watching ice give way on a river in spring, that slow groan and then the sudden crack, the whole hard surface of a man breaking up at once and the live water moving underneath. He'd walked into that supper to prove he was stone. And she'd reached past the stone and named the one soft thing he'd forgotten was still in there, named it in front of everyone, and handed it back to him. He didn't say anything. He couldn't. His jaw worked and nothing came. And then, and this is the part Deacon never forgave, the part the whole county chewed on for a year, Amos Rourke put his hand up over his own eyes. This hard-bit rancher in front of half of Coldwater, and his shoulders went. And it was a moment before any of us understood the man was weeping. Deacon made a disgusted sound and shoved back his chair. A few went with him. Most just sat there not knowing where to put their eyes, and I'll be honest, I looked down at my book like it might tell me what to do. The widow Alvarez got up quiet from her end of the table, went to Desna and put a hand on her shoulder, the only touch of kindness that whole night that came unbought, and Desna reached up and covered that old woman's hand with hers and held it. That's where I stopped writing. The pencil just quit in my fingers. Some things you don't want a record of because the record is thinner than the thing. You just want to have been there. They left not long after. Amos got his coat and got hers, and he did a thing I'd never once seen him do. He held the door and he waited, and when she came through he didn't walk ahead of her the way a man does, the way he'd walked ahead of Ellen 100 times without thinking. He walked beside her. Small thing. Everything's small things, I've come to believe. The whole shape of a life is small things laid end to end. Now, I could tell you it was Mendied right there, that the cruel question got its beautiful answer, and the two of them rode off into a soft life. But I keep this book because life doesn't run in those clean lines, and I won't lie in it now. What she'd done was crack him open. What she hadn't done, what nobody can do for another soul, was fill him back up. That was still all to come, and it came hard. The county did not forgive Amos for that supper. A man weeping over an Apache woman in public, they could have handled him beating her, they'd have understood that, but tenderness they could not abide. His stock buyer suddenly found reasons. His credit at the Coldwater store went stiff. Deacon took to riding his fence line, checking strays, in a way that was pure threat, and twice that winter Amos found gates open that he'd left shut and cattle scattered into the draws, and once a heifer with her throat cut and left to say what it meant. And inside the house, it was its own slow country to cross. I was over there through that winter more than I'd been in the 3 years since Ellen died, partly to help Amos with the stock trouble and partly, I'll admit, because I'd never seen anything like the two of them and I couldn't look away. He was clumsy with her. Lord, he was clumsy. He'd lived alone in his grief so long he'd forgotten how to be in a room with another person's. And here was a woman carrying grief that made his look like a scratch. Her whole people scattered, her family dead or penned at San Carlos, her language a thing she could only speak to the wind because no one for 100 miles would answer it. I watched him learn her. It took months. He learned that she went still and far off on certain evenings, and he learned not to fill that quiet with talk but just to be in it near her. He learned she wouldn't eat rabbit, some reason of her people's he never fully got and stopped asking, and he quit hunting them. He learned her name had a sound in her own tongue that the English Desna only pointed at from a distance. And one night I was there when he tried to say it right, the real one, stumbling and getting it wrong and trying again, and she corrected him soft twice, 3 times, until he got close, and when he got close she smiled, the first true smile I ever saw on her, quick and whole and gone, and said, "Yes, that one, that is me." He wrote it down that night, borrowed my pencil and a leaf of my book and wrote her real name out phonetic so he wouldn't lose it. This man who'd never written down a tender thing in his life, and folded it into his shirt pocket over his heart like a fool, like a boy. And I had to go outside and stand in the cold a while. And Ellen's sewing basket, the one he couldn't move for 3 years, I came in one March morning and it was gone from the parlor. I about said something. Then I saw it on the porch, out in the light, and Desna was sitting by it in the thin sun with Ellen's needles in her brown hands, mending one of Amos's shirts, using a dead woman's tools to keep a living man warm, and neither of them had made a ceremony of it. She just asked, I suppose, and he'd just said yes, and a 3-year wait had lifted off that house so quiet nobody'd noticed the moment it went. I noticed, I wrote it down. The basket is on the porch. He let her move the basket. Some men would call that nothing. Some men called the whole thing nothing, right up until the night it stopped being nothing and turned into the thing that nearly cost them both everything. Because Deacon wasn't done. Deacon was never going to be done. And the marshal's man who talked about San Carlos and irons, he was real, and he was still out there, and the paper that made Desna safe was only as good as the man whose name was on it. And that spring, Amos Rourke got sick. It started as a cough, and it went to his chest, and it stayed there. And by the second week of it, Amos Rourke was flat in the bed he'd shared with Ellen when Ellen died in it, burning up, out of his head half the day, and the same diphtheria-black memory sitting over that house like a buzzard that knew the place. I was there most of it. So was the widow Alvarez when she could get away. But it was Desna who did the work of it, and I have never watched anyone fight a thing the way that woman fought Amos's fever. She didn't sleep. I mean, she did not sleep. I'd doze in the chair and wake, and she'd be exactly where she was, cool cloth to his neck, spooning broth between his cracked lips, talking to him low and steady in her own tongue when he was too far gone to hear English. And I came to understand she was doing it on purpose, that she decided somewhere in her own reckoning that if he was going to wander toward the dark, she'd put her language down like a rope for him to follow back. Sounds that meant nothing to me and everything to her. Her mother's sounds, her people's, spent on a white rancher in a lonesome bed. The doctor came out from Coldwater once, took his $2, said keep him warm and cool his fever, and it's in God's hands now, which is what a doctor says when he means he doesn't know. On his way out, he looked at Desna the way that whole town looked at her, and he said to me on the porch, quiet, "You know if he goes, she's got no household. That marshal's man'll have her at San Carlos inside a month. Might be a mercy get her back with her own." And he rode off pleased with his mercy. I didn't tell her he'd said it, but she knew. Of course she knew. She'd known from the start exactly how thin the thread was that held her whole life, that it ran through one sick man's chest, and if his heart quit, so did she, penned and marched off in irons to a place her people were dying of the flat air and the government beef. She could have run. I want you to sit with that. Somewhere in those black nights when the fever peaked and it looked like Amos wasn't going to see morning, she could have taken a horse and grub and gone south, gone anywhere, taken her one chance while the county was distracted, and the man who owned her safety was too far gone to notice. No one would have chased an Apache widow. They'd have been glad of it. She didn't run. She sat in the chair by a dying man who had humiliated her in front of 40 people on the night he married her, and she spent everything she had left keeping him on this side of the ground. Not because it was safe, it was the opposite of safe. Her safety was the one thing that died with him. but because she had told the truth at that supper table, and she was a woman who lived inside her own truth. She'd married the man who gave the old man water, and you do not leave that man to die alone in the dark. Not if you're her. There was a whole way of being a person inside that choice that shamed everything I thought I knew. On the 9th night his fever broke. I was asleep in the chair. What woke me was the quiet, the terrible new quiet of him not laboring for every breath, and I lurched up sure he was gone, and he wasn't. He was lying there wet through and hollow-eyed and looking at her, weak as a newborn calf, and she was slumped forward with her head down on the edge of the bed, finally asleep, one of her hands still wrapped around one of his. And Amos Rourke lay there and looked at his wife asleep holding his hand after 9 nights of not sleeping to keep him breathing, and he didn't wake her. He just moved his thumb, slow, weak, back and forth across the back of her hand, over and over, this small helpless stroking, keeping the one part of himself that still had strength on the one part of her he could reach. I got up quiet and went out on the porch, and I did not write anything down for a long while. He mended slow through that spring. And here's where I'd give you the sweet ending if life dealt them, and it didn't quite because that same season the marshal's man did come. Not while Amos was dying, that would have been too clean a cruelty, but after in May, riding into the yard with papers and 2 deputies, come to check that the Apache woman on the Rourke place had a lawful white household accounting for her, because a complaint had been filed. Filed by Deacon. Of course it was Deacon. And Amos Rourke, who could barely sit a horse yet, who'd lost 40 pounds and half his wind, walked out into that yard on legs that didn't want to hold him and stood between those men and his wife. I was there. I've got it in the book, the whole of it, the closest thing to word for word I could manage. The marshal's man read his paper, said the marriage was in question, said there was a claim it was a sham arrangement to shelter a reservation Indian, said such an arrangement had no standing, said she'd be taken to San Carlos pending review. And Amos, swaying on his feet, said, "Ask her." The man blinked. "Ask her what?" "You want to know is it a real marriage or a sham?" Amos said, and his voice was a ruin from the sickness, but it didn't waver. "You got a cruel question in your hand there, and you come to ask it of her like everybody does. So ask her, but you look at her when she answers. You look her in the face like she's a person, and you listen to what she says, and then you tell me to my face she's not my wife." He got a breath. It cost him. "I asked her a cruel question once myself in front of the whole town. I asked it to break her, and instead his jaw worked the way it had that night. She gave me back a piece of myself I'd buried with my boy, so you go ahead, ask her. I'll wait. I got the rest of my life." The marshal's man looked at Desna. And whatever he'd come expecting, a cowed reservation Indian, a bought silence, a woman who'd give herself away as the arrangement they'd been told she was, he didn't get it. She stood straight in Ellen's mended dress, and she looked that man level in the eye. No fear in her at all that I could see, only that deep, unhurried dignity she'd worn into a hateful church 7 months before, and she said something to him. Lo, I didn't catch all of it, and I've never asked either of them what the rest was, because some words belong to the 2 people they pass between and nobody else. But I caught the end of it. I caught her say, "I chose him. No paper made me, no hunger made me, I chose him. That is the only kind of marriage there is." The marshal's man stood there a long moment. Deacon, off on his horse at the gate, said something ugly. The man ignored him. And whatever was in that lawman that the job hadn't killed yet, there's a little left in most of them, I've found, buried deep the way it was buried in Amos. It stirred, and he folded his paper and he put it away. "I'll report the household as lawful," he said, short. He looked at Deacon. "And I'll note the complaint was filed in bad faith by a man with a grudge, so he'll think twice before he wastes a marshal's ride again." He touched his hat to Desna, touched his hat to her, a thing I'd never seen a white man do, and he gathered his deputies and he rode out. Amos's legs went right after, just folded. She caught him or half caught him, and I got the rest, and the 2 of us walked him back inside between us with his arms over our shoulders, and he was laughing, this thin cracked laugh, and crying too, both at once, the way a man does when a thing he was braced to lose gets given back. I'm an old man now. Deacon's dead, his own heart, not anyone's doing. Amos and Desna are down in the New Mexico country last I heard, gone somewhere the story of that supper didn't follow them, somewhere they could just be a rancher and his wife and not a scandal. She had children. I heard she had children and that she taught them her mother's sounds, the ones she'd once had nobody to say them to, and I think about that more than's probably good for me. The last time I saw them, the day they loaded the wagon to go, Amos gripped my hand and couldn't hardly talk and finally just said, "You wrote it all down. That night, what she said." "I did," I said. "Don't lose it," he said. "Whatever else you lose, don't lose that one." I promised him I wouldn't, and I haven't. It's in the book still in my bad handwriting, the cruelest question I ever heard and the answer that unmade it. You gave the old man water. And under it, in ink I added later, the only line in this whole record that's mine and not just something I overheard. A hard man asked a question to make a woman small. She answered it and made him human instead. I have kept cattle and weather and debts in these pages for 30 years and never once written down anything.